First of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here, and thanks to Tom for the invitation. I'm going to give you basically a position about refugee politics, the policy that currently is being implemented by the Australian government, that's supported bipartisan way by both major parties. I'm going to critique that position and take a position of suggesting a policy that I think should replace it. And I'm going to do that in a couple of ways. One is by looking at the issue in a broader historical way, look at how the world has come to deal with refugees over a long period of time, and refugee law to a certain extent, although I'm not an expert like Matthew, who will be here later, give you an historical background about how refugees come to be treated differently, or should be treated differently, from any other person who wants to travel between countries or settle somewhere else. Let me start by talking about a boat, a ship actually, but not a ship that was coming to Australia, and not a recent one. In fact, this was a ship, the MV St. Louis, which left Hamburg Harbour in 1939 carrying 937 mainly Jewish asylum seekers. This is a period when serious persecution of the Jews under the Nazi regime had begun, but the Second World War hadn't. So it was still possible to get out in this way, leaving on a ship. And in fact, these people were somewhat better off than most Jews in Europe, because they were able to pay for their passage to go to Cuba, as it turned out. They were able to secure documents and even to get Cuban visas arranged for them. So they were actually travelling entirely legally to Cuba. But when they got to Havana Harbour, the Cuban government said that the problem was that if they allowed them to come in, then perhaps hundreds of thousands of others, perhaps more, Jews fleeing Europe might also descend on Cuba, a wave which would engulf this small island with its small population. And so they refused to allow them to land. They remained on board the ship, and eventually the captain decided to try to get to the United States, to land the refugees in the United States. He went to Florida, and the US government refused to allow them to land either. Again, the argument used was if they were allowed to land, that would send a signal to other Jews back in Europe that they too could come to the United States, and there could be millions of people coming. The captain actually he's something of a hero in this, a German captain named Schroeder, who tried very hard to land his passengers in the United States. In fact, he even contemplated running his ship ashore and wrecking it to force the issue so that the US would have to take them, something that ship's captains don't very often do. But the Coast Guard shepherded him away from the coast. He went all the way up the east coast of the United States. Delegations were sent to Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the Jewish community and so on, but to no avail. They weren't landed in the US. They went to Canada and got exactly the same response. So eventually the ship was forced to go back across the Atlantic. It went to the UK, and a few hundred people were actually accepted in the UK, but the bulk, 619, were then forced to return via the ship to France, Belgium and Holland, which, as we now know, was soon to be invaded by Nazi Germany. And we now know for sure from the records that 254 were murdered in the Holocaust that followed in Europe. As a result of this and thousands of other stories like it, of people not being able to find refuge during the Second World War, and there were tens of millions of people who'd sought refuge during that war. As a result of that, a number of countries came together in 1951 to draw up a document, the International Refugee Convention, which suggested that there was something different about refugees from the ordinary movement of people. That is, that if I want to travel to the United States and work there, I have to go through a procedure of getting a visa, a work permit, all of those kinds of things. I have to have a passport, my documents in order, and so on. The Refugee Convention suggested that it was not the norm at all for refugees to have the ability to do those things. In fact, the normal mode of transit for refugees was going to be irregular. And therefore, the convention makes no mention of how you arrive, does not require you to have a visa in order to seek refuge. Not necessarily to get it, but to ask for refuge in countries that are signatories to the convention, which Australia signed in 1954. And it made clear as well that your method of arrival did not determine the justice of your claim for refugee status. It could be that you were tramping across a muddy border in the dead of night to get out of persecution, the persecution of your home country. It could be that you came by ship like the MV St. Louis. It could be that you flew by plane, or it could be that you came by a leaky boat. It didn't make any difference to your claim for refugee status. And that was something that Australia accepted in 1954 and accepted throughout the following decades until, in fact, the 1990s, and in particular until 2001. Since the 1990s, in fact, since 1992, we have become the only country in the world to have mandatory detention. Mandatory detention means there's no question about whether you're going to be locked up. If you come in these ways, you are going to be locked up. In 1992, this was introduced, you might think, because of a huge flow of refugees into Australia. In fact, no. 214 people came, only 214 in that year. And in fact, they came from Cambodia, which is ironic, given that the Australian government is now trying to send refugees back to Cambodia. We were the only country in the world, and we're still the only country in the world to have that form of detention. But it was limited in 92 to 273 days. The following year, that limit was abolished, so there is no limit on detention at all. People can be there at the pleasure of the Minister for Immigration, currently Peter Dutton, forever. And many people in Manus and Nauru have been there between 3 and 4 years already in those detention centres. In 2001, a boat carrying a few hundred asylum seekers attempted to come to Australia from Indonesia and sank. And a Norwegian freighter, the Tampa, did what ship's captains are supposed to do, and to rescue those people from the sea, and also to take them to the nearest port, which is what the law of the sea says you should do. The Australian government refused him entry into an Australian port, and in fact landed Australian commandos on the ship to make sure that that wasn't going to happen. And as a result of that, and this was, you won't be surprised, just before an election, and an election where the current government was, the government of the time was behind in the polls, the Howard government, the government said everyone who comes in this way to Australia seeking asylum will not only be detained if necessarily indefinitely, but will be detained not in Australia but in other countries. In this case, Nauru and Papua New Guinea in Manus Island. The Pacific Solution, as it was called, was an attempt to stop the flow of boats and of people on them seeking asylum. It operated between 2001 to 7 and from 2012 until today. And just yesterday, the Minister, Peter Dutton, said Nauru would stay open no matter what. Offshore detention was ongoing, would continue indefinitely. Then in July 2003, again just before another election, and again one in which the government of the time, the Rudd government, was very far behind in the polls and looked set to be slaughtered in the election, Rudd introduced yet another element in the equation, which is not only that you will be detained indefinitely in another country, in Manus or Nauru, but also whatever the results of the processing of your claim for refugee status, you will never be settled in Australia. And that's the situation that we're currently in with the people who are detained in Manus and in Nauru, ever, no matter what the determination of their refugee status. So what the government wants us to believe, and I think this is a very Alice in Wonderland, down the rabbit hole twisting of the realities, is that the asylum seekers are the threat. And we are the ones who are threatened by that. And in fact, you might remember that medical professionals around the country, just very recently this year, banded together to refuse to send back to detention, in this case to Nauru, these kids who were in Australia for medical treatment, and others, adults as well. And in fact, there were picket lines in Brisbane to attempt to stop the Department of Immigration sending back a baby, in fact, an infant, back to Nauru. The government also wants us to believe that Nauru and Manus Island are safe places. I think the historians of the future will have no difficulty writing the story, and a pretty shameful story, about offshore detention in particular, but the detention system in general, because there is now overwhelming evidence, absolutely overwhelming evidence of the conditions in those places and what they are doing to people. We have the evidence of, most recently, 2016 incident reports about things that have happened to people in Nauru alone. Manus Island, we've got lots of evidence as well. And in fact, we have organisations like Amnesty International which have done investigations and issued reports which are publicly available about both Nauru and Manus Island, which are completely damning about the effects of detention on the people there and how those places operate. We have organisations like the UNHCR, which have also documented the conditions there and condemned them internationally. We have our own Human Rights Commission, Professor Gillian Triggs, which released a report into children in detention, which again was absolutely scathing about the traumatic effects on kids' lives, being blighted, in fact, by their detention there. And we have medical professionals. We have Professor David Isaacs, who spoke here just a week ago at ANU, who looked at, in fact was on Nauru and wrote a report, a whistleblower, if you like. There are over 100, I think, now whistleblowers, are there not? 103, something? 103 whistleblowers. That is primarily Australians who've worked on Nauru or Manus Island, who've released reports, in fact, given evidence to the Senate inquiry in some cases, spoken out to the media in other cases about the conditions there. And they come from medical backgrounds, from teaching backgrounds, from social work backgrounds. They're professionals whose opinion is that these places are not places that people should be detained, and particularly those who are already traumatized by their prior experiences. There is also an argument the government's making now that since the Nauru gates have been opened, there's actually no detention there anymore, and that people are free to come and go as they wish, so there's not a question of them being detained. This is Nauru, 21 square kilometres. That's Melbourne Airport, 23.7 square kilometres. And this seems to me to be a pretty fair sort of detention, particularly when people very often are not welcome in the Nauruan community. The detainees are not welcome there, are harassed and beaten and so on. So let's look at the broader situation with refugees. The government wants us to believe, and constantly says, that we're an especially generous country in receiving refugees. Now it's true, the resettlement program, the people who are actually resettled in Australia, Australia does fairly well at that. But according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, late June this year, released its latest figures, it claims that about 65.3 million people are now asylum seekers, refugees, or internally displaced people. Internally displaced, they're still in their country of origin, but they've been forced to leave where they actually live, their homes and their communities. So, for example, the refugees of Syria, the displaced people of Syria, about half of them are still in Syria, but not where they came from. The other half are outside Syria. About 86% of the world's displaced people outside their own countries, 86% are in low or middle income countries close to the sources of conflict. So the largest recipients of refugees are Turkey. It's the largest in absolute numbers because it shares a border obviously with Syria. Lebanon, which has the highest proportion of refugees per capita of anywhere in the world. Jordan, again. Pakistan, which takes refugees from Afghanistan, and so on. Now, where we stand in terms of the number of refugees and asylum seekers that we host, that is, who are actually here in the country, in absolute numbers, we rate 48th in the world. In terms of our population, we're 62nd, and compared to our GDP, which is, I think, probably the most important comparison, we're 74th in the world. So we're way, way back in terms of generosity to refugees. There's also a misunderstanding sometimes about how people get refugee status and get resettled. There's an idea out there, which again I think the government has consciously fostered, that there's an orderly queue that people can sign up to. Like if they wait their turn, then eventually they'll get an outcome. In fact, the UNHCR has contact with less than 4% of the world's refugees. That is, they're in places where they can actually apply for refugee rights. Most of them aren't in that situation at all. And 51%, by the way, of the world's refugees are children. So very difficult. Now, are we being swamped? Currently, the quota of refugees that Australia accepts is 13,750. So I put the Australian population and 13,750 in a spreadsheet, and that's the result. I didn't forget to enter the data. On that scale, you can't see it. And you wouldn't see the 13,750 spread throughout the Australian population at all. What if we, and that represents one refugee for every 1,745 people living here. So let's do a little bit of an experiment and triple that quota from 13,750 to about 40,000. Let's suppose we did that. What would the graph look like? Again, you might just, maybe not, actually see a shadow of a bar. Very small. Put that in terms that we can more easily understand. Oh, no, first of all, another graph. In terms of the total increase in the Australian population, if you're worried about population increase and the effects on whatever, jobs, the environment, whatever it is, if you're worried about those things, then actually the refugee quota is really tiny, both in terms of the total increase in the Australian population and in terms of net overseas migration. It's a very, very small part of the movement of people into Australia or the growth of the Australian population at the moment. So let's do this experiment of tripling the number of people that we take, and we raise the quota to 40,000, which is easily sustainable. What would it mean in terms of the ANU? It's about 22,000 students, I think, at the ANU. Now, this is tripling the quota, and assuming that refugee intake is spread evenly across the country, that would represent an extra 37.8 students at the ANU. My class in international relations at the moment is 496, I think. I could, if they came to the lectures, I wouldn't notice them at all. No one would notice them. Bruce Stadium, if you're a football follower, full capacity 25,000, triple the quota, and you get an extra 40.8 people in the stadium if it's completely full. So these are tiny numbers, and those are tiny numbers if we're 3 times as generous as we are now. So what did we used to do? Because in many ways what we're arguing for in this campaign is not something that's a revolutionary new idea. We're basically arguing to go back to the sorts of things that we used to do in terms of both accepting refugees and the way in which we accepted them. The last great flow of refugees into Australia, large-scale flow, was the Indo-Chinese refugee flow, particularly between 1977 and 1983, after the fall of Saigon. Large numbers of people, possibly 2.5 million people, actually left, mostly Vietnam, left Indochina. Many of them in boats. About 250,000 of them died on the way, by the way. They fled Indochina, and many of them got to transit countries where they couldn't permanently settle, like Malaysia, like Thailand. Some got to Singapore, some got to Hong Kong, etc. But in that period, Australia roughly settled a total in the whole period, well, no, in that brief period, 100,000 refugees. This is in a smaller population, remember. At the time, it was about 16 million in Australia, as opposed to 24 million today. In the longer period, we ended up settling closer to 200,000, about 185,000 refugees. So again, a very substantial number of refugees were settled, and the sky did not fall. And in fact, today, no one really thinks about it as being anything other than a contribution to nation building. And interestingly, in that period though, although we issued those huge numbers of visas, in fact, only 60 boats came to Australia. And just over 2,000 people on those boats. Why was that? It's because most of them flew. And they flew with visas granted by the Australian government after processing had taken place in the countries of transit, particularly the east coast of Malaysia, the coast of Thailand, and other places where Australian immigration officials went. They determined whether or not these people were Vietnamese refugees. If so, they took some of them. Other countries, the US took the most, Canada took a lot, France took a lot as well, but essentially, although it wasn't perfect, the system meant that, as far as I know, people actually arriving in Australia by boat, those 2,000, not a single person died at sea, as far as I know. And not a single boat was turned back either. So there's an alternative to what we're doing. I think, first of all, offshore detention is a disaster. Manus Island has already been ruled unconstitutional by the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court. There's no indication of what will happen to the 850 or so men who are there at the moment. The Australian government has suggested Cambodia as a place to go, and in fact spent $55 million on resettling 5 people there, $10.5 million each, of whom only 1 remains in Cambodia. We've got to get rid of offshore detention. We should just follow the 51 Refugee Convention, which does not discriminate on the basis of means of arrival. That whether you arrive by plane or you arrive by boat or whatever, we should simply follow that convention. But the objection to that, and I think it's an objection made by reasonable people with real concerns, is that if we do that, won't there be deaths at sea, drownings at sea, as there were between 2007 and 2012. Maybe over 1,000 people died at sea in that period. And in fact, at the last Labor Party conference, the then minister, the Labor Party, the last Labor Party minister for immigration, Tony Burke, in fact made an impassioned speech about the death of a child named Abdul Jafari, who died in a boat that went down on his watch, and used it as an argument for having a system of deterrence in place to prevent people taking those risks. The thing is, if people take those risks, they do it because they feel they have no viable alternatives to them. But people leave their own countries and they can get to a country like Indonesia. In fact, they can get there without a visa in the case of Indonesia, because it has a visa on arrival system for about 30 mostly Muslim, in fact entirely Muslim countries. So you can fly there without having all the documentation and so on. But once you're there, you're stuck. You can't work, your kids can't get educated if you have kids with you, you don't have any long-term future there. And Australia was hardly processing anyone. In 10 years, we took processed visa applications for refugee status from Indonesia, fewer than 500, 50 a year. Someone calculated that if you worked out how long it would take to get a visa waiting in Indonesia, it would take something like 257 years, something like that. In other words, simply not a viable alternative. That's why people get on boats. Not because they were careless with their lives or their kids' lives, but because we didn't give them an alternative to doing it. As Malcolm Fraser did with the Vietnamese refugees in the 1970s and the 1980s. So first of all, we should increase the number of refugees we resettle so that we can provide a realistic alternative. And then we should do fair and rapid processing in the countries of transit, which for us particularly means Indonesia, and then fly people to Australia. We should spend on refugees and asylum seekers waiting for resettlement and processing in those transit countries rather than spending vast amounts on detention. The budget for detention in Australia, the deterrence budget in 2014, and it would be similar today, was $3.5 billion. The UNHCR's total budget for looking after the refugees of the world is $7 billion. This is lunacy in terms of the money that's being spent for a tiny number of people in order to make what is essentially a political point rather than a good policy option. I'll leave it there, Tom, and perhaps questions or arguments. Or